She remembered dying. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind where a woman runs out of reasons to stay, and the world never notices she's gone. She remembered a man she married in a torn dress while her whole family laughed. A security guard. A nobody. A man every person in the room had already dismissed before she crossed it to reach him. And she remembered what she never found out until it was too late. Now she's back. Same ballroom. Same sister in red. Same mother with her hungry eyes. Same man standing in the shadows, wearing the same uniform, carrying tattoos she couldn't read the first time. This time she can read them. This time she already knows where the story ends. The only question is, can she survive it long enough to change it? Subscribe to Romance HeartFlix TV and step into stories where love, secrets, and fate refuse to stay buried. There are women who survive their lives by forgetting them. And then there are women like Rudo Dubé, who survived hers by remembering every last detail of a life she was never supposed to live twice. She stood in the middle of that glittering ballroom with a champagne flute she hadn't touched, wearing a sapphire blue gown that fit her like it had been poured onto her body, and she watched her younger sister work the room the way a blade works a wound, with precision, with purpose, without apology. Cece's red dress caught every light in the chandelier-soaked hall. Her laugh carried the exact frequency designed to make powerful men feel chosen. Rudo had watched this scene before. Not this room exactly, but this exact feeling. This specific ache of knowing how it ends while the rest of the world is still reading the opening line. Rudo. Her mother materialized at her elbow, silk gown pressed to perfection, desperation pressed even deeper underneath. You are not smiling. Everyone is watching. Let them watch, Mama. This is the Kim Prestige Singles Gala. Mrs. Dube's voice dropped to the urgent hiss she reserved for social emergencies. These are not ordinary men. These are men who can change your bloodline, your future, your entire fate. Stop standing there like a woman at a funeral and go. Rudo looked at her mother. The hungry eyes, the calculating jaw, the silk that was doing so much work to say what the woman underneath it couldn't bring herself to admit. And she thought, you have no idea what a funeral looks like. Not yet. She had been reborn. She knew at the moment she opened her eyes that morning to the sound of her mother fussing over Cece's hair in the next room. The same argument. The same morning. The same city pressing its noise through the curtains like it hadn't been there for the last several decades of a life she was apparently going to live again. The vertigo had lasted 40 seconds, maybe less. And then it had cleared. And what was underneath it was not confusion. It was memory. Perfect, complete, devastating memory. She had lived this day. She had stood in this ballroom. She had watched Cece win the man, win the status, win the years of their parents' approval, while Rudo made the choice the whole room mocked. She had married the guard. And the guard had turned out to be the most dangerous man in 3 countries. And she had died, not dramatically, not in blood, but in the particular quiet way that a woman dies when the world has taken everything from her and she is too exhausted to rebuild. She had died without ever knowing who her husband really was, without him ever knowing she had understood, without any of it meaning what it could have meant. This time would be different. She set down the champagne. She was not going to compete for Jun Ho Kwan. She was not going to stand in lines of performance. She was not going to let her mother's ambitions wear her like a dress. She had already read this chapter, and she knew how it ended, and she had decided, somewhere in the 40 seconds of vertigo that morning, that she was done with every version of this story that didn't have her choosing herself first. But choosing herself, she had come to understand, meant choosing him. She found him before she meant to. He was at the far end of the room, half in the shadow of a tall potted palm, wearing a security guard's uniform that did nothing to disguise the fact that he was the most physically formidable man in the building. He was Korean. Tall, not the decorative kind of tall, the structural kind, like he'd been built for something other than standing in rooms. His jaw was cut sharp enough to cast its own shadow. His shoulders filled the dark uniform the way architecture fills a doorframe, broad and certain, and not asking permission. And across his throat, just visible above the collar, the edge of a tattoo, dark ink climbing from beneath the fabric, the beginning of something vast that the uniform was barely containing. His eyes moved through the room the way a soldier moves through terrain, methodically, without urgency, missing nothing. He was the most still person in a building full of motion. Ruto felt something shift in her sternum, something that remembered. She walked straight toward him. "You look very familiar," she said when she reached him. "Have we met before?" He turned and looked at her. Something quick moved across his expression, surprise, recognition, both wrong and both gone in under a second. His eyes were the kind of dark that made other colors seem unnecessary. "I don't think so," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, and carried the particular weight of a man who has learned to say very little and mean all of it. "I'd remember. Maybe you've seen me in a dream." Something almost happened to his mouth. "Maybe." His name, he said, was Hyun. Just Hyun. And he told her this corner of the room was not where the interesting things happened, and she should go enjoy the party. And she tilted her head at an angle that told him very clearly she was not going anywhere, and asked him what it would take to impress her. He produced a card from nowhere. Turned it over. Her name was on it. She stared at it, and then at him, and the almost smile became real, just barely, just once, and it hit her somewhere between the throat and the ribcage, and she thought, yes, that is the smile. That is the one I remember. From across the ballroom, a man in a charcoal tuxedo was watching her. Bok Chul-soo had not planned to be here. He had a dead grandfather, a dynasty to manage, a city that moved when he told it to, and no interest whatsoever in performing eligible bachelorhood for a room full of people who would sell the performance back to him with interest. He had come because Junho had asked, and because his grandmother had called 4 times that week, and because sometimes it was easier to appear briefly than to explain at length why he would not. He was not, by any ordinary measurement, difficult to look at. Tall, significantly, unavoidably tall. The kind of build that made tailored suits look like a second opinion, broad across the shoulders and chest, lean through everything else. The structure of someone who treated his body the way he treated everything else in his life, with the discipline of a man who understands that strength is not a vanity, but a form of argument. His jaw was sharp, his eyes were heavier-lidded and more dangerous than any man at a matchmaking gala had a right to be, and his face, in its most unguarded moments, was the kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with trying. His hair was short and dark and neat. His expression was closed and contained, and had been since approximately the age of 19 when his father was killed in a warehouse outside Seoul, and Bok Chul-soo became the dawn of the most quietly powerful criminal organization in South Korea before he was old enough to vote in a general election. What no one in this ballroom could see, because the tuxedo covered it completely, was the tattoos. From the base of his throat to the backs of both hands, from both shoulders down to the wrists, across the chest and back and sides, the ink told the story of the family he had inherited. Black lions rampant at the collarbones, a serpent coiled at the right forearm, cherry blossoms at the left shoulder that had taken 4 sessions and bled like an argument. Symbols of loyalty and consequence, genealogy written in skin. He had carried them since 17. They were not decoration. They were biography. He watched the woman in the blue dress across the ballroom. She was laughing with the guard. Actually laughing, the kind that didn't check the room first to see if it was landing. She had a face that made the ballroom's architecture feel approximate, high cheekbones and deep ebony skin, and a long graceful neck and eyes that he could not quite reach from this distance, but that seemed, from here, to be doing more thinking than anyone else in the room. Her figure in that blue gown was the kind of composition that made a man feel the distance between himself and her as a specific, personal inconvenience. His aide murmured something into his ear. Her name was Ruto Dubé. Zimbabwean. No wealth. No connections. No status the room could use. Chul-soo watched her laugh again. He was not going to do anything about this. He was absolutely certain of that. He was not certain of it at all. He was always careful. Later in the evening, when the gala had loosened into its second, louder hour and the pretense of civility was wearing pleasantly thin at the edges, Ruto stood near the glass doors to the upper terrace and felt the approach before she saw it. Sukmin, Junho's cousin. Expensive cologne, and the moral architecture of a man who had never been told no by anyone he found attractive. She stepped back, and the railing was there. He stepped forward, and the space between them was not. "You look lonely," he said. "I'm not." His hand moved toward her waist. Get your hands off her. The voice came from somewhere behind him, and it was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of voice that lands in a room the way certain silences do, as a complete rearrangement of the available options. Sukmin went still first. The understanding came after. He turned and found a man in a security guard's uniform standing 3 feet away with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up with it. The tattoo was visible at the throat, one edge of it above the collar. A piece of something enormous. Something in Sukmin's face performed a very fast calculation and reached the only sensible conclusion, which was a hasty departure. Rudo looked at the man who had just rearranged the evening without raising his voice.
"Thank you," she said.
"Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She studied him. The collar, the ink, the stillness, the way the room had bent slightly around him without knowing it had. "You keep appearing." "Bad habit," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this man whose name she already knew and whose history she was beginning to remember, and she said, "Marry me." He stared at her. "I know how this sounds," she said. "I mean it anyway. 3 days from now. I'm a security guard." "I know. You should find someone. I've done that," she said quietly. It didn't go the way everyone promised it would. He looked at her in the way he had, as though he was reading something written in a language he didn't know he spoke. The tattoos at his collar were dark and deliberate and old. His jaw was a line that had never softened at the wrong moment. 3 days, he said finally. 3 days. All right. Behind them, in the ballroom, a rival family had sent 3 men to the gala who were not there to find wives. They had been watching Chul-Soo since he arrived. They had noted the tuxedo, the absence of his usual security, the single aide. They had been given a photograph and a window. The window was closing as he stood here in the shadow of a potted palm talking to a woman in a blue dress, and the man with the photograph had already taken out his phone. Rudo did not know this yet. She would not know it until much later. By then, everything would already have changed. 3 days later, she stood in her wedding dress with a torn shoulder seam in a modest venue and her father's back turned to her and her mother's contempt in the air and Cece's cruelty on full public display, and she breathed, and she waited, and she did not cry. The dress tore because Cece made it tear, her elbow catching the fabric as she passed, the diamond on her bracelet pulling the seam open with a sound that everyone in the room heard and many found satisfying.
"So sorry, sis."
"My diamonds, you know how it is." And the smile. Always the smile. "You are an embarrassment," her mother said. Standing there in a ruined dress waiting for a broke nobody who probably isn't even coming. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" She had a very good idea. She was counting on it, in fact. The doors opened. He filled them. Not the way men fill doorways in ordinary stories, with drama and announcement. He filled them the way water fills the lowest point of a room, completely, inevitably, without making a sound. The security guard's uniform was clean and pressed. The tattoos at his collar and wrists were visible in the venue's light. He walked through the crowd, and the crowd moved, not because they knew who he was, but because something in the body moves away from certain kinds of certainty on pure animal instinct. He reached her. "I'm sorry I was late," he said. Quiet. Only for her. "You came," she said. "I said I would." The ceremony was short and completely real, and when it was done, Cece stood with Junho, and the expression on her face was bright and brittle, and had already started calculating the next move. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she said as they passed. "I'll crush both of you." Rudo walked out on her husband's arm and thought about the pendant at her throat and the life she was walking into, and the things she did not yet know, and the things she remembered, and the terrible distance between them. She had loved this man in the other life without ever knowing his name.
His real name.
His real weight. What he carried, and what he was capable of, and what it would cost her to be beside him. This time, she intended to know. All of it. Before it was too late. And the men who had been photographing him at the gala were already making calls to a family whose name made even other dangerous people careful. A family called Fontana. A family that had been waiting 7 years for the right moment to move against the Bach organization. The right moment they had just decided was now. The morning after the wedding, She made him breakfast, eggs and tea, and the strange, quiet comfort of two people learning the dimensions of a shared space. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the plate, and for a moment, under the ordinary morning light, he was just a man who had not expected to be cooked for, and that surprised her more than everything else combined. She handed him tea. "Consider it a thank you," she said, "for showing up." He sat across from her, and underneath the dark of his rolled sleeves the ink was visible, patterns and symbols she did not yet have the vocabulary for, running up both forearms in the particular language of a life she hadn't been invited into. She made herself not stare. She made herself ask, instead, about her mother's birthday that evening.
He came.
He was late, something at work, he said, and she did not ask what kind of work leaves a man with that particular tension in the jaw and that particular way of checking the room when he enters it. He came, and he stood beside her when the room laughed at her cake, and when Cece displayed Junho's Italian jewels, and when their mother looked at Rudo with a specific disappointment of a woman who had chosen her winner already. He stood beside her through all of it without saying a word. And somehow the silence of him was louder than anything else in that room. Until the pendant. The silver lion pendant she wore at her throat. The one he had pressed into her palm the morning after their wedding. Old silver. Intricately carved, heavy with something she couldn't name but could feel. A lion rampant on a chain worn smooth by a century of hands. Caught the light at the wrong moment, and her uncle saw it. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something dangerous has been introduced. That pendant. Her uncle's voice had lost its party register. That belongs to the Bach family. The real one. His eyes moved from the pendant to the man standing beside Rudo and back again. That is the patriarch's mark. Laughter, because no one in that room could make the calculation add up. The security guard. The nobody husband. The patriarch's mark. It didn't compute, and so it was funny. His family has kept it for generations, Rudo said steadily. It was gifted. It is not stolen. Cece's hand shot out. What followed was a game with a knife inside it. The glass balanced on Rudo's head. The shot fired too close. Cece's final offer. Walk across the broken floor barefoot, or watch the pendant be destroyed. Her parents watched. They said nothing. Rudo looked at her father, who had refused to walk her down the aisle, and at her mother, who had already decided this outcome was acceptable, and at her sister, who held the pendant like a trophy she had earned by existing, and she stepped onto the glass. It cut. She did not stop. She walked the length of that floor, and did not make a sound her sister could use, and when she reached the end and looked up, something in Cece's face was already cracking at the edges, the specific fracture pattern of cruelty that has encountered something it cannot break. Then Cece raised her ringed hand toward Rudo's face. Don't touch her. The voice was not loud. It never needed to be. He crossed the room and put himself between them, and the temperature in the space around Cece dropped in a way she would remember for a long time afterward. The tattoos at his wrists and collar were dark in the party lighting, old symbols of a history that was about to make itself very present in this room. He knelt and cupped Rudo's face in his hands and looked at her bleeding feet, and she said, I kept your pendant, and he said, nothing is more precious to me than you, and the room heard both of these things, and the room understood, slowly, that it had badly miscalculated the evening. You're just a security guard, Junho said.
He was still trying.
He had a very fast face. And then his aide touched his arm and leaned in, and Junho went entirely still. That pendant, the aide said, very quietly, is real. That crest belongs to one family. Only one. He looked at the man in the security guard uniform, the tattoos at the collar and wrists, the absolute stillness. That's the dawn. Junho's face did something that took several seconds to complete and was not pleasant to watch. The men Chul-Su had brought with him, who had been outside, who had been dealing with 3 Fontana men carrying a photograph and very bad intentions, filed quietly into the room behind their dawn, and the evening, which had started as a birthday party, revealed itself as something else entirely. If you want to know how far this night still has to fall, and what the Fontana family wants with the dawn, and what Rudo does not yet know about the man she has chosen, then stay with us on Romance HeartFlix TV. This is only the beginning. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and come back for part 2, because the real danger hasn't even introduced itself yet. If this story pulled you in, then you're not ready for what happens next. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Nobody told Rudo that the man she had married was being hunted. She found out the way she found out most things about him. Slowly, in pieces, the picture assembling itself from details that didn't make sense individually but were beginning to, collectively, to form the shape of something vast and dangerous and entirely too close. The night of her mother's birthday ended not with resolution, but with departure. Chul-soo cleared the room with 6 words and the particular quality of presence that didn't need to be explained to anyone who felt it, and when the last of them had gone, Junho pale-faced and rearranged, her parents silent for the first time in Rudo's living memory, Cece at the door with an expression she hadn't worn before and would not wear again for a long time. He lifted Rudo from the floor and carried her out of that house. She fell asleep in the car with her head against his shoulder and the pendant closed in her fist, and she did not wake when he carried her inside, and she did not hear the conversation he had with 3 men in the corridor outside the room where he'd laid her, voices low and clipped and moving fast through information that had arrived at the gala and been managed quietly before it reached the door. The Fontana family had sent 3 men to the gala. They were not there to attend. They had been intercepted before they reached the building, 2 of them, but the 3rd had gotten close enough to confirm what they'd been sent to confirm, that the Dawn was present, accessible, and, crucially, alone. This was information they would act on. Chul-soo gave his orders in the corridor and closed the door. In the morning, Rudo sat up in a room with high pale ceilings and strange silence and bandaged feet, and he was in the chair by the window watching her the way a man watches something he is afraid of losing for the 2nd time. "Where are we?" she asked. "Somewhere safe. You're bleeding." She had spotted it immediately, the bandage at his left shoulder, just visible under the white shirt. Not the gesture of a man who had simply had a difficult evening. The gesture of a man who had been managing something she had not been allowed to see. "It's nothing. It is not nothing." She swung her legs toward the edge of the bed, and he was across the room in 2 steps and sitting at the edge of it, close enough that she could see the tattoos on the back of his hands, detailed, dark, the kind of work that had taken months, symbols she didn't have the language for threading across the knuckles and up the wrist. "Who did that to you?" He was quiet for a long time. "Hyun," she said, and she used his name the way a key uses a lock, with specific intent. "I am not a woman who frightens easily. I have spent my entire life in rooms where I was not supposed to figure things out, and I have figured them out anyway. So you can either tell me something true or watch me arrive at my own conclusions. And I promise you, my conclusions are thorough." Something moved across his face. Something that was almost respect and was edging towards something warmer. "I can't tell you everything yet," he said. And the word yet was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "Is the danger real?" "Yes." "Are we safe right now?"
Right now.
"Yes." She looked at him. The jaw, the stillness, the ink on his hands and wrists disappearing beneath his sleeves, the shoulder that had been cut last night and that he was treating as a minor administrative matter, and she made the decision that would define the next several weeks of her life.
"One more chance," she said.
"Then the truth. All of it. After things settle," he said.
"No."
"After I ask for it. When I ask, you tell me. Everything." A pause. "Agreed." "Good. Now take off that shirt so I can look at your shoulder properly. And before you tell me it's nothing again, I want you to know that I grew up with 2 brothers and a father who thought wounds were a sign of weakness, and I have been cleaning and wrapping injuries since I was 9 years old, so." He almost smiled. He took off the shirt. The tattoos were extraordinary. She had seen the edges of them before, at the collar, the wrists, the backs of the hands, but the full architecture of them across his chest and arms and back was something else entirely. A black lion rampant at each collarbone. A serpent in motion down the right forearm. Cherry blossoms in full bloom at the left shoulder, the very shoulder that was now cut, the petals disrupted by the wound. A phrase in Old Korean script across the ribcage that she could not read. Geometric patterns connecting everything, dark and precise and deeply, deliberately personal. She dressed the wound and did not ask about any of it. She filed it all away. She was building a picture. The woman who arranged their next chapter was Mrs. Pack. She was in her 70s, and she moved through the corridors of her estate like winter moves through a building, quietly, completely, leaving everything colder than she found it. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had watched 3 generations of dangerous men make decisions and had learned to assess the consequences before the decisions were finished being made. She offered them a room, a role each, and a deal that was dressed as practicality and was actually a test that Rudo could already feel the edges of. "You'll work as a maid," Mrs. Pack said to Rudo. "Of course," Rudo said. "You understand what that means. What people will assume." "I understand what people assume when a woman does honest work," Rudo said. "I've been understanding it all my life." Mrs. Pack looked at her for a moment with those still, reading eyes. "You're not what I expected." "No," Rudo agreed. "I rarely am." The estate was large and beautiful and quietly hostile in ways Rudo catalogued on her first morning. Yuna was petite and swift, and her cruelty had the efficient quality of someone who had practiced it. Sora was wider and slower and more deliberate, the muscle to Yuna's precision. Mrs. Park, the housekeeper, had already chosen her loyalties before Rudo walked through the door. The bucket of water was not an accident. The scolding that followed was not fair. Rudo cleaned the floor and made a mental note about which corners of this house were actually dangerous. She was building a picture here, too. What she did not know, could not yet know, was that in the city something was moving. The Fontana family was not a small operation. They were the particular kind of organization that had existed in the margins of the Bach family's power for 30 years, tolerated because they were manageable, because the Don who came before Chulsu's grandfather had made an arrangement that was now several arrangements old and increasingly fraying. They wanted the Bach territory. They had always wanted it. And now they had something they had not had before: a wife. A woman outside the family, unprotected by the family structures, who could be used to reach the man the family's walls had kept inaccessible for years. They were watching the estate. Rudo did not know this. She was busy learning the house. She learned it the way she learned most things, by paying attention to what everyone else was too comfortable to notice. The east corridor was cold in the afternoon because of the window that didn't seal properly. Mrs. Pack always walked it at 3. She liked warmth but would not ask for it, because asking for things was a form of debt in Mrs. Pack's moral architecture, and she preferred to be owed. Rudo had a shawl ready on the 4th day. Mrs. Pack took it and walked on. But she had looked at Rudo first in the way Rudo had been hoping for, the look of a woman revising an opinion she thought was final. The pastries that nearly killed her were Sora's work. Peanut oil in almond macaroons, careful and plausible enough to be an accident for anyone who didn't know it wasn't. Rudo knew it wasn't. She knew from the satisfaction in Yuna's eyes that was half a second too visible before the performance of panic began. She moved to the herb cabinet. She had marked it on the first day, and applied the oil to the welts with hands that did not shake, and watched the red fade back from Mrs. Pack's skin, and thought about the kind of house this was, and the kind of women it had produced, and the kind of woman she was going to have to be to survive inside it. "You could have died," she told Mrs. Pack when the room had emptied. "I've nearly died before," Mrs. Pack said, dry as old paper. "At this point, it's practically seasonal. You're important to people who love you. That should frighten you a little." Mrs. Pack looked at her. Important to whom specifically? Rudo thought about the man she had married, the way he said her name in the dark, the way his hands were already calloused in places she was still learning. "To the people who would be left behind," she said. A silence. Then, from the corner of the old woman's mouth, something small and real. What Rudo did not see. Sora, already slipping from the room with a purpose that had nothing to do with remorse. Lia Kong was the daughter of the Bach family's head capo, and she had decided, in the private accounting she kept of the universe's debts and credits, that Chulsu Bach owed her a future. They had grown up in the same orbit. Her father had served his grandfather. She had been told, by enough people who should not have told her, that she was the natural choice for the position beside the Don. She had arranged her life around this understanding for 5 years. She had not been asked. And now there was a maid. A Zimbabwean woman with no family connections and a pendant at her throat that had been in the Bach family for 100 years, which meant Chul-Soo had given it to her, which meant something that rearranged every calculation Leah had been running since she was 22 years old. She arrived at the estate in full offensive formation, ivory silk blouse, statement earrings, the particular walk of a woman who has decided she is the main character of this scene. She found Rudo in the garden hanging linens, and she walked across the grass toward her like she owned it. Which of you is the one who has been throwing herself at the dawn? Rudo turned around. She took exactly the amount of time she needed to read Leah's face, the entitlement, the desperation underneath it, the fear that was being channeled directly into aggression. And then she said simply, "If you mean my husband, I don't throw myself at my own husband. I love him." The word husband landed in Leah's chest like a stone in still water. The argument that followed was not a small one. It moved through property and status and the pendant and history and arrived, finally, at Leah's outstretched hand and her absolute certainty that this woman in a maid's uniform would flinch. Rudo did not flinch.
No, she said.
Just the word. No apology attached. Mrs. Johnson appeared at the garden gate, and the confrontation ended as suddenly as it had arrived, Leah departing with cold calculation in her eyes and a longer game already forming. Mrs. Pack watched from the upstairs window and said nothing, but her expression had shifted into something that looked a great deal like finally. That evening, Chul-Soo told Rudo about the family gathering. He sat across from her in the small room they shared, and he said the words carefully, the way a man handles something fragile and hot at the same time, and she listened with the pendant at her throat and the full knowledge that this was part of a test she had been placed inside without being told the rules. "After the gathering," she said, when he was done. "After the gathering," he agreed. "The truth. All of it. Every part you've been keeping." "Yes." She stood. She was a woman in a maid's uniform in a borrowed room inside an estate she didn't own, and she had bleeding feet that were healing and a husband whose real name she was still learning to hold, and a family gathering to plan that would either prove she belonged here or prove everyone right about her. And she felt, standing there in the lamplit quiet, something she recognized from the other life. The feeling of a woman who has decided to win. She didn't know that across the city, in a cold concrete room, her sister had just found a woman who wanted the same thing Cece wanted and was willing to burn everything down to get it. She didn't know that the Fontana family had shifted their strategy, that they were no longer planning to come at the dawn directly, that they had identified a softer entry point, that the family gathering was being studied as an opportunity by people who understood exactly how to manufacture chaos out of innocence. She didn't know that one of the women in this very house was already on their payroll. She stood in the small room and looked at her husband and made her plans for the gathering, and somewhere in the distance, the city held its breath. Come back for part 3 on Romance HeartFlix TV. Leave a comment telling me whether you think Rudo knows more than she's letting on. Hit the notification bell, because what comes next will break something in you before it puts it back together. I promise. If this story pulled you in, then you're not ready for what happens next. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe, and turn on notifications. 3 weeks before the gathering, a woman named Chai Min-young was found dead in her apartment on the east side of the city. She was 26. She had worked as a junior records clerk for the Bach Estate Administration for 4 years. She had no enemies anyone could name. The official finding was cardiac event. Chul-Soo knew it was not a cardiac event. He said nothing to Rudo. He filed the information in the place he filed everything that could hurt her, behind the part of him that had decided, from the night of the gala, that she would not carry the weight of this world until she had chosen to carry it with full knowledge of what it was. He increased the outer security rotation by 6 men. He had Kong begin running names against the Fontana family's known network. And every morning he came back to the small room they shared and sat across from Rudo at the table and watched her plan the gathering with the focused intelligence of someone who had already studied the terrain from every angle. She had no idea. Or perhaps she did. He could not always be certain with her. She was up before dawn on the morning of the gathering. He found her at the window with her notes in the half-dark, the sky outside the color of a bruise going pale, her coily hair wrapped in deep wine silk, her face in the lamplight doing the specific expression she wore when she was building something in her mind and checking every joint for weakness. He put his hands on her shoulders. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You're going to be brilliant tonight," he said. "I'm going to be prepared tonight," she said. "That's close enough." He almost told her then. About Chai Min-young. About the 3 Fontana men at the gala. About the 7th man in the outer rotation who had filed his last report 2 days ago and had not filed since. He had been going to tell her. The words were ready. She turned to face him with those eyes that had always seen more than he had offered, and she said, "You'll be there?" "At the banquet." "I'll be there," he said. He left the 7th man's disappearance for Kong to manage, and he went to dress for the gathering, and in the room where he stood in front of the mirror and buttoned a shirt over the tattoos that covered his chest and arms, the lions, the serpent, the cherry blossoms above the healed shoulder, the genealogy of a dangerous family written permanently into his skin, he allowed himself, briefly, the thought that this might work, that tonight might be the night he came through clean. That the woman at the window with her notes and her silk hair wrap and her particular quality of absolute resolve was going to be safe. The thought lasted about 40 seconds. Then Kong appeared in the doorway. The 7th man had been found. He had not been found intact. The Fontana family was already inside the city's edge. Coming tonight. Chul-soo adjusted his cufflinks and said, very quietly, "Let them come." And then he said a number of other things that sent Kong out of the room moving quickly and quietly with the expression of a man who has just received a weight he intends to carry as far as it needs to go. The estate was transformed. Rudo had done something to that ballroom that even Mrs. Pak, who had seen every gathering in 40 years of family history, could not dismiss. The florals were sourced from 3 different suppliers and layered in a way that felt simultaneously abundant and precise. The table settings had been personally checked twice for detail, and once for what each arrangement communicated about the honor being extended to the person seated there. The lighting was exactly the warmth that made powerful people feel understood rather than merely seen. She had memorized every dietary restriction, every interpersonal friction, every territorial sensitivity among the 12 family heads who would be in that room tonight. She had not slept the previous night in the way of a woman who intended to fail. Mrs. Pak walked through the ballroom at 3 in the afternoon and stood at the center of it in the particular stillness of a woman recalibrating everything she had told herself about this marriage. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" "Not a thing," Mrs. Pak said. She walked out, and in the corridor, out of sight, she said to the aide beside her, "Tell Vincenzo his wife is the most capable person in this house." The aide delivered the message. Chul-soo received it, standing in a corridor off the East Wing, reading a report about a Fontana operative who had entered the city 3 days ago using a transport company the Bach organization used for legitimate business. He read the message from his grandmother. He folded the report.
He thought about Rudo at the window this morning.
He thought, not tonight. I will not let tonight be the night. The banquet began at 7. Rudo moved through the evening like a conductor moves through a performance. Not visible, not performing, but responsible for everything that was happening and the reason none of it was falling apart. She caught a wrong temperature on a whiskey glass at table 4 and corrected it before it reached the guest. She rerouted a service path when she sensed a conversation at table 7 that needed 30 additional seconds of privacy before being interrupted. She had the kitchen delay a course by 4 minutes because the family head at table 1 had paused in an expression that meant he was about to say something his neighbor needed to hear without being hurried. She was extraordinary. And in the service corridor behind the East Wing, while she was checking that the whiskey for Mr. Romano at table 4 contained no ice, Chul-soo appeared behind her and covered her eyes. She gasped. She spun. She laughed. The real kind, unguarded and sudden, the kind she didn't give the room before she checked it first. His hands were warm on her face, the tattoos on his fingers dark against her deep ebony complexion, the cherry blossom at his shoulder just visible above the collar of his formal suit. "You scared me half to death," she said. "I couldn't help it." He cupped her face. "You did this. Every person in that room is comfortable and honored and well-fed because of you. You understand that."
"Go back," she said.
"Someone will notice." "I love you," he said. Simply. The way he said all the important things, without ceremony, without preparation, as though the statement didn't require either. She looked at him, and something in her chest did the thing it always did. I love you too. Now go. He went. He did not know that a Korean woman in a dark jacket and a Zimbabwean woman with newly shortened hair were 20 feet down the same corridor, pressed against the wall in the shadow of a service doorway. He did not know that Sora had a phone lifted and was filming. He did not know that all of it, the 5 seconds, the hands on her face, the laughter, was already being shaped into a story about an affair, an accomplice, and a conspiracy that would reach the capo within the hour. What he did know, because Kong had told him 40 minutes earlier, was that 2 Fontana men had entered the estate through the East Service entrance. He had his people moving. He had given the order quietly, as he gave all orders. By the time the banquet dessert course was being served, both men were in a room in the sub-basement with their hands bound, and the family gathering proceeding above them in complete ignorance of what had almost happened. He had not announced this. He had not had time to find Rudo and tell her. He had been managing it from the inside of the gathering while appearing to be a guest. This was the gap the capo walked through. Rudo was brought to the interrogation room because she went willingly. She had nothing to hide. She sat across from the older man with his silver close-cropped hair and his 30 years of service and his absolute faith in the evidence he had been given, and she watched the door open behind him and her sister walk in, and she understood in that moment with a clarity that was almost physical exactly what had been built, and who had built it, and how long it had taken. She's been having an affair with the guard, Cece said. The word affair landed in the room like something thrown.
You're lying, Rudo said.
No heat. No performance. Just the simple declarative fact of it. Am I? Cece's smile was the smile of a woman who had constructed the lie carefully enough that she had almost convinced herself. Look at where you are. A guard, a maid, and the nerve to call me a liar. The guard is my husband. The maid is me. And the liar, Rudo said, is you.
It has always been you.
Chulsu was brought in. He came without resistance, because the first thing he did when he entered the room was find her face and ask with his eyes the single question that mattered. Are you hurt? And she answered no with hers. And then he stood still and looked at the capo with the expression of a man who already knows how this is going to end and is choosing, for reasons of his own, to let it play out. Leah's voice from the corner. Kill them both. Cece's voice, lighter, easier, the worst version of her. They need to be made an example. The capo looked at his commanders. Rudo looked at her husband. In his eyes was the thing she had been reading since the gala, the thing she had been learning the language of through the pendant and the tattoos and the mornings at the window and the way he stood in doorways. It was not fear. It was the absolute refusal of a man who had decided something and was not going to be moved from it. He was telling her, without words, that he was not going to let this happen. But she could also see, in the set of his jaw and the controlled stillness of his hands, that he was managing something, that the people who needed to know what he was were 30 seconds from knowing it, that the reveal was coming and that the reveal was also a detonation, and that after it nothing in this room would be what it had been. And in the half-second before the reveal, Rudo looked at her sister. Cece was watching her with the expression she wore over the top of everything else, the triumph, but underneath it, visible now in a way it had never been before, was the grief. Old, untreated, completely inaccessible. A woman who had spent 30 years competing for love in a family that had distributed it like a finite resource and had decided the allocation early. Rudo had walked on glass for this man. She had been humiliated in a wedding dress. She had cleaned floors and been doused with water and been accused of crimes she had not committed and stood in the path of a bullet and been offered no protection by the 2 people in the world who were contractually obligated to provide it. She looked at her sister's grief and she thought, I know what that is. I've lived inside it. I understand the exact temperature of it. She looked away. If one of us has to die, she said to the room, to the capo, to everyone who had built a wall of assumptions around the word nobody, then kill me.
He doesn't know anything.
He came to the corridor, because he came to find me. The gathering was my responsibility. Whatever negligence exists is mine. Take me. Stop, Chulsu said. And his voice did the thing it did. Landed in the room like a physical object. He's innocent. I am in charge. Take me. The capo said. Proceed. Put the gun down, said the voice in the doorway. The room turned. He stood there in the formal suit, the dark fabric, the white dress shirt, the first button open, the edge of the tattoos visible at the collar and wrists, the lines at the collar, the ink on the backs of his hands, and he looked at the capo with the expression of a man who has returned to his own house and found it slightly rearranged.
Dawn, the capo said.
The word came out like something that had been in his chest for 30 seconds already and needed to be released. Yes, Chul-Soo said. Me. The silence was the kind that happens when an entire room revises its understanding of every previous hour simultaneously. Liao looked at the floor. For the first time in the story, she had nothing. Cece looked at Rudo. In her eyes was the old war, yes, and the old burning, yes, but underneath both of them now was the crack Rudo had been waiting to see for 30 years of this life, and the last one combined. The place where the armor had given way. You always win, Cece said. This isn't winning, Rudo said. Nobody wins when family destroys itself. Chul-Soo handled the capo with the precision of a man who had grown up understanding the difference between justice and punishment. He handled Lia by sending her home with a formal notation on her family's record. He turned to Cece and Chunk, what remained of them, and asked, with the particular quiet of a man who could ask anything in exactly that tone, what they would like him to do. Rudo said, "Let me talk to her." The room emptied. The two sisters stood in it alone. And Rudo spoke to Cece in the language she had been trying to learn for 30 years. Not the language of competition, not the language of family as obligation, but the plain bare language of two women who had both been failed by the same people in different directions. I never wanted what you had, Rudo said. I wanted you to stop being in pain. Those are not the same thing, and I spent our entire childhood confusing them. Cece's jaw worked. I let you win things when we were little. Card games. Arguments. I thought if you felt like you were winning you might feel like you were enough. It didn't work. Don't. I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you the truth, because you deserve to have someone tell you the truth for once, and I'm the only person left who will.
She paused.
You're not my enemy, Cece. You're my sister who has been in a war for so long you've forgotten there was ever a world without it. The silence that followed was the longest of the evening, perhaps the longest of their lives. I don't know how to stop, Cece said, very quietly. And it was the most honest she had ever been in either of their memories. I know, Rudo said. She walked to the door. Chul-Soo was waiting. He put his arm around her, and they walked out of the room and down the corridor, and behind them Cece sat down on the floor of the empty room and put her face in her hands, and let the armor finally break. The family heads departed saying it was the finest gathering in a decade. The capo was removed from his position by morning. The Fontana men in the sub-basement were transferred to a location the Fontana family would not easily find. And Mrs. Pack found Rudo in the midnight garden under the old pine tree and sat beside her and said, without preamble, his heart knew something I didn't.
Thank you, Rudo said.
Ma'am. Mrs. Pack made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Don't thank me yet.
She paused.
The Fontana family will try again. You understand that. Rudo was quiet for a moment.
Yes, she said.
I know. Are you afraid? Rudo thought about the other life, the quiet ending of it, the way she had died not in blood, but in the slow erosion of a woman who had never been told what she was part of and had therefore never been able to choose it properly. She thought about the pendant at her throat, the lions at his collar, the cherry blossoms that had bled. Not of them, she said. Mrs. Pack sat with this for a moment. Good, she said finally. Then you might just survive this family. Do not go anywhere. Subscribe to Romance HeartFlix TV, hit the notification bell, and come back for the finale, because the Fontana family is not finished. The truth is finally coming, and what Rudo does with it is going to leave you wrecked in the best possible way. The letter arrived 3 days after the gathering. It was addressed to Rudo in handwriting she did not recognize, on paper that was expensive and plain, and it contained 4 sentences. The first said that the Fontana family knew who she was. The second said that they knew she mattered to the Dawn. The third said that they had someone close to her who they would use if she did not leave the Pack estate within 48 hours and take the pendant with her. The fourth sentence said, "We are not making a request." She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She went to find Chul-Soo. He was on the east terrace at past midnight, leaning on the stone railing with his forearms resting on the marble, looking at the garden below with the stillness of a man who has been managing something alone for long enough that alone has started to feel like the only available configuration. The formal suit jacket was folded over the railing beside him. His dress shirt was open at the collar, the tattoo at his throat fully visible in the terrace light, the edge of the lion, dark and old, the beginning of the chest piece that covered everything the shirt normally hid. The ink on his forearms was detailed and deliberate in the lamp glow. Cherry blossoms.
Serpent.
The genealogy of 4 generations of a dynasty he had inherited at 19. She put the letter on the railing in front of him. He read it. He read it again. He put it down. His jaw did the thing it did when he was running numbers, tight, precise, not angry yet, just calculating.
"How long have you had this?" he said.
2 hours. I didn't come to you immediately because I needed to decide something first. What did you decide?
"That I'm not leaving," she said.
And that I'm not giving them the pendant. And that I'm done waiting for you to tell me what I'm actually inside. He turned from the railing to face her. She was wearing a deep burgundy wrap dress that moved in the terrace air, and the pendant was at her collarbone, and her natural coily hair was loose and full in the night, and her wide dark eyes were doing the thing they did when she had already decided, and was offering him the courtesy of a conversation before acting. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and she was the most frightening, and the combination had been pulling at something in his chest since a corner of a ballroom where she had walked toward him like she already knew.
"Sit down," he said.
"I'd rather stand." Of course she would. He turned back to the railing, and she came to stand beside him, and he began. He told her everything. The Bach family. 4 generations. His grandfather, who had built the organization from 2 blocks of territory in Old Seoul, and had done it with the kind of patience that looked like virtue from the outside, and was something considerably harder from the inside. His father, who had grown it, who had been a larger man in every way, taller, louder, more present, a man who had entered rooms like weather and left them altered, who had been killed in a warehouse outside Seoul when Chul-Soo was 19 by a faction inside the organization that had since been completely dismantled, piece by piece, over the following 6 years, by his son, quietly, with the kind of thoroughness that left nothing to chance and nothing to memory. He told her about his grandmother, her conditions, her particular architecture of love, which required proof before it extended itself, her fury when she learned about the marriage, her careful, grudging, absolute capitulation in the garden after the gathering. He told her about the Fontana family, about the 30 years of managed hostility, about the intelligence that had been coming in for the past 2 months, the reorganization of their command structure, the new funding from a European source he had not yet fully identified, the shift from grudging coexistence to active aggression. About Chai Min-young, the records clerk who had died and whom he had not told her about, and whose absence had been the missing note in a chord he should have named sooner. About the 7th man in the outer rotation who had not filed his last report. Ruto was quiet through all of it. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely without filling the silence, processing rather than reacting. "The pendant," she said when he was done. "You gave it to me knowing it would mark me." A pause. "Yes. You gave it to me anyway." "I gave it to you because you were already marked. You walked into the corner of a room at the gala and chose the man everyone was meant to overlook, and that choice was visible, and it was going to have consequences regardless. The pendant didn't create the target. It created the protection." He paused. "And because," another pause longer, "because I wanted you to have it. Because I have never given it to anyone, and I have never wanted to until I had not yet finished telling you my name." She was quiet for a moment. The city below the terrace wall glowed, with its ordinary distances. "You were afraid," she said. "Not an accusation. A recognition." "Yes. That if I knew what you were, I'd never know if what I felt was real." "Every person who has ever wanted anything from me has wanted the title first," he said. The title, the protection, the power, the weight. I have been Bok Chul-soo, the Dawn, since I was 19 years old, and I have never once been certain whether the people who stayed for me, or for what I was. He looked at her. You walked across a ballroom toward a security guard. You proposed to a nobody in a uniform. You married me in a torn dress in front of a room that was laughing. You cleaned floors in this house, and held your head at the same height regardless. I needed to know that what you were was not contingent on what I was. I needed to know. And you walked on broken glass, he said, for a pendant from a man you married because of who he was in a dark corner with no one watching. I know. She looked at him for a long time. I walked on broken glass, she said, for a man who stood between me and something dangerous without being asked. That's who I chose. That's still who I'm choosing. I don't care about the title.
She paused.
But I need you to never keep something like this for me again. The letter. The Fontana family. Chai Min-young. Her voice stayed steady on the dead woman's name, which cost her something. I am standing inside this life with you. I need to see it clearly. Not the version you've decided I can handle. All of it. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held a long time released, not dramatically, not with noise, just the particular giving way of a man who has been carrying a thing alone and has finally found a place to set it down.
All of it, he said.
From now on. Good. He reached into his jacket and held out the pendant.
She stared at it.
He had taken it from the railing beside them. She hadn't noticed him pick it up, and it lay in his open palm. The silver chain pooled around the black lion charm, old and solid and warm from the stone it had been resting against. This is not a crisis moment, he said. This is not because you fought for it or bled for it or because I needed you to prove something. This is because I want you to have this with full knowledge of what it means, in a moment where no one is threatening either of us and no one needs to be stopped, and there is nothing at stake except the truth. He paused. In my family, when the Don gives his wife this pendant, she is not beside him. She is equal to him. She is his counsel and his counterweight and his partner in every room, every decision, every consequence. Not because of what she came from or what name she was born with. He held her gaze. Because of who she is. She reached out and took it from his hand. Obviously, she said, and the corner of her mouth did something small and real. Did you think there was another answer?
He laughed.
The full one. The one she had been gathering since the gala, like something rare. He clasped the chain around her neck himself. His hands were warm at her nape, the tattoos on his fingers dark against her deep ebony skin, the lion settling against her collarbone in the terrace light. Mrs. Pak found them there at 1 a.m. She looked at the pendant. She looked at her grandson's face. She sat down on the stone bench at the terrace edge with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just finished arguing with herself and lost. You passed the test, she said to Rudo. More than passed it. You passed things I didn't design, and several I didn't anticipate. She was quiet. I want you to understand something. This family has enemies. The Fontana situation is not finished. I know, Rudo said. Do you know what that means? What it will require? I know what it will require, Rudo said. I've been building toward it since the morning I woke up remembering how the other version of this life ended. I will not let it end that way again. Mrs. Pak went still. What did you say? She said. Rudo looked at the old woman. And she told her. Not everything. Not the details of a life lived in the wrong direction and ended quietly without understanding why. But enough. The outline of it. The vertigo of the morning. The certainty of what she had walked into with both eyes open. Mrs. Pak listened with the stillness of a woman who had seen enough unusual things in her life not to dismiss unusual testimony out of hand. When Rudo finished, the terrace was completely quiet. You chose him, Mrs. Pak said, knowing. Both times, Rudo said. Mrs. Pak sat with this. Then you are not what I thought you were, she said finally. What did you think I was? A brave young woman.
She paused.
You are considerably more than that. She got up and went inside, because she had said the thing and that was enough, and because her eyes had gone bright in the way of a woman who will not be seen being moved if she can help it. In the morning, There was a knock at the side entrance. Rudo was in the kitchen making tea when she heard it. Not as a duty, just tea, just morning, just the particular pleasure of a day that had not yet asked anything of her. She opened the door. Cece stood on the step. She looked like a woman who had spent the night sitting with herself and found the company more honest than she was used to. Her shorter hair was neat but plain. She wore a simple gray top and dark trousers. No jewelry, no performance, no armor. Her clasped hands were the only thing that betrayed her. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said immediately.
"I know," Rudo said.
What passed between them in the doorway was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was something more honest than either. Two women standing in the morning light and looking at each other without the costumes they had worn for 30 years, and finding that what was underneath was tired and complicated and human and not, perhaps, irreparable. Cece told her that Junho was gone, left the city. She said it without grief, which was its own kind of information. She said she was going home.
Harare.
That she needed to begin something and she did not yet know what it looked like, but she knew what it was not. And what it was not was everything she had been doing. She turned to leave.
"Cece," Rudo said. She stopped.
"I did let you win things when we were little," Rudo said. "Card games. Races. Arguments with Mama. I let you win because I thought if you felt like enough, you'd stop trying to make me feel like less." Something in Cece's face broke open and put itself back together in the space of a single breath. "You're so annoying," she said, her voice thick with something that was not quite crying. "I know," Rudo said. Cece walked down the path. Rudo watched until the garden swallowed the last of her. Chulsu appeared at her shoulder. "She might come back," Rudo said. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. She leaned into him slightly. The tattoo on his forearm was warm under her hand. The pendant was warm at her throat. The morning was warm on both of them. "The Fontana family," she said. "What happens next?" "We move first," he said. "I've been waiting to move first for 2 months. The evidence from last night's men gives us enough to dismantle their current operation before they regroup. It won't be permanent, but it will set them back long enough for us to restructure the external perimeter." He paused. "I'll explain all of it. Tonight. You should understand the full picture." "I should," she agreed. "Mrs. Pack wants to introduce you formally to the extended family. Not as a maid or a mystery, as the woman of the family. Whenever you're ready."
She thought about this.
The extended family, with all its history and all its tests and all its particular requirements. The Fontana family reorganizing. The city outside the estate walls, moving through its ordinary distances with no idea what was being managed inside them. The life she had chosen twice, with full knowledge of its cost. "Next week," she said. "I want 2 days first. Just ordinary days. Tea and quiet and you." "Done," he said. "And I want to go to Zimbabwe. Not soon, but eventually. I want to go home and see it from the eyes of someone who is not afraid of what she doesn't have." He took her hand. The pen on his fingers was warm between hers. "All of that," he said, "I can give you." She believed him. That was the thing she had carried from one life into the next. Not the pendant, not the name, not the geography of his tattoos or the weight of his family's history, but this, the knowledge that belief, extended to the right person in the right corner of a room, is not naivety. It is the most precise and deliberate act a person can perform. It is, in fact, the only act that means anything. She had walked on glass for this. She had stood in a torn dress and buried her fear and made her choice in a city full of people who told her the choice was wrong. She had done it twice. She was not sorry for a single step. Life does not give most people a second chance at the life they were supposed to live. If you get one, if you wake up one morning and the vertigo clears, and what's underneath it is the pure shocking memory of everything you should have chosen, take it. Hold it the way Rudo held that pendant, even when someone is trying to break the chain. Love the person you chose because of who they are when no one is watching. Stand in the difficult rooms. Carry the weight you agreed to carry. That, right there, is what makes a winner. Thank you for being here from the beginning, for every part, every comment, every moment you stayed when it got hard. If this story lived in your chest the way we hoped it would, subscribe to Romance HeartFlix TV, Share it with someone who needs to believe that choosing character over convenience is always worth the cost. Hit the notification bell. Leave a comment telling me the moment that broke you open. I read every single one. See you in the next love story.